Hello and welcome to the video. In this video, this is a second part of a two-part series where we're looking at integrating EF Core and Redis into a single Blazor application. In this video, we're going to continue the process of integrating Redis into our application. I've made a few changes since the last video, nothing too major, but I wanted to be able to more properly show how things are working right now. So I've added a couple of variables here just for messaging, and we'll use this is cache data later on for styling. I've added a task await here so that we can easily see how fast or how slow this thing is running. So again, right now we're only using the database to pull our data. So let me run this. And here we have slow data. So click the button to load the data. And there you see we loaded from the database. If I click again, so nothing too great to see there, but you do realize that there's that delay. There's about a 2-second delay between me clicking the button and the actual response. And that's what we were seeing as well when we were doing the actual query. I would execute the query, and you can see here, it's about 2 seconds before I get a response back. So let's close this down, and let's start adding in our ability to use Redis. So the first thing we're going to need to do is add a couple of NuGet packages that allow us to use Redis. So let's right click on our project and go manage NuGet packages. And here we're going to, first one we're going to look for is Microsoft.extensions.caching.stackexchange Redis. So let's install that one. Okay. And the second one we're going to look for is Stack Exchange. And we'll just, when you do that, the first one that actually comes back because it's so popular is stackexchange.redis. So let's install that one. And done. So we've got our NuGet packages. So I guess I should show the page. I did make a few changes over here as well. So I was checking this variable, this load location. So if it's equal to an empty string, that's where I was just saying, okay, click the button because you haven't loaded any data yet. And then after that, it just checks for the list to see if it's null or empty. And if so, it just shows it's loading. And then if it gets some data back, it loads that data into the table like we were talking about. And then I added this div here to actually show the where it's going to be loading from, and that'll come in, more use as we add Redis as one of our options. So now that we've got those NuGet packages, the first thing we're going to want to do is go to our startup, and we need to configure this new service. So let's do services dot add stack exchange Redis cache, and we need some options. And let's do curly brace. And let's do options dot configuration equal to configuration dot get connection string. So this is going to be how we're going to connect to our Redis instance, and we'll just call this Redis. And this doesn't exist yet, but we're going to put this into our app settings.json file here in just a second. And then the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to add an instance name, and we'll just call this Redis underscore or Redis demo underscore. And so if we were using multiple applications hitting the same Redis server, we wouldn't want all those applications to be um, calling in. You could possibly duplicate your keys. So we're going to use an instance name to control what we're actually using, and then that way we're not hitting any non-unique keys. So that's got that. Let's put a semicolon. Save that. All right. And now let's go add our Redis connection string to our app settings. So over here, we will just, okay, so we'll do Redis, and mine's on localhost. And I'm using the default port, but I'll go ahead and specify the port anyway and save that. So now we've got our connection to our Redis server set up in our JSON file. Close that. We're done with our startup. We can close that out. So the next thing we want to do is just kind of add a class or an extension method so that we can do gets and sets to our Redis cache server. So let's add a new folder here. And I'm just going to call it helpers. You could call it extensions, whatever your preference. And let's add a new class. Let's call this class Redis. I'm going to call it Redis cache extensions. You can call it whatever you'd prefer. Okay. So here, the first thing we want to do is just, let's go ahead and make this class static because we're going to use it possibly in multiple locations. Okay. Now let's do our first method, which is going to be the set. So we're going to do a set. Okay. And again, this is a pretty generic method, so you can actually use this in other applications as you need to. So we're going to do a public static async task, and we'll call it set record async, and a generic t, and then this, and this indicates that it's an extension method, so you'll be able to use your object dot set record async. So, and we're going to use I distributed cache. We'll call it cache string record ID, and that's going to be our key. So that's got to be unique whenever this gets called. We don't know what's going to be sent in, so we're going to do t.data. Let's do a time span and make it nullable. And we'll do absolute expire time and equal to null. So I'll automatically set it to null if that parameter isn't set. So time span, we'll do another one, unused expire time, null. Okay, let's do control period. And let's start setting up our actual method here. So the first thing we need to do is actually set some options on our cache. So let's do options equal new distributed entry options. And we'll say absolute expiration relative to now. And then we're going to look at our absolute expiration time, expire time. We'll do 2 question marks to check for null. And if it's null, we'll say time span dot from seconds 60. Okay, so this is going to default it to expire our cache 60 seconds from the time that we create it if the calling method didn't send something different. Okay, and sliding expiration. So this is a way for the Redis cache server to know that, okay, there's an absolute expiration, so no matter what, it goes away. But possibly, if you haven't used it in, say, 30 seconds, maybe that's too long. So in 30 seconds, just get rid of it if nobody's using it. And so we'll just use the unused expire time here. And close that out. So we need our JSON data. and JSON data, actually, sorry, JSON serializer dot serialize, and whatever data is getting passed in. And let's control period, and we'll use system.text.json. And finally, we'll do await cache.setString async. We'll pass in our record ID, which is our key. We'll pass in our data that we want to store in the cache, and we'll pass in our options. And let's rename this to options. There we go. And that's our first method. So that's the method we can use to actually create various key elements on our Redis server. So our next method we need to be able to get from our Redis server. So public static async task, again using T, but this time we're getting record async T. Again, we've got to use this keyword, distributed cache, and this time we just need to pass in the key and what we're calling our record ID. So that's that. So again, we've got our JSON data, and we're gonna wait a call to our cache dot get string async, passing in our key. Now there's a couple of things that could happen here. We could get data back, meaning that that key exists. We could also get back a null, and that would just mean that the key was not found. So let's check for that. So if JSON data is null, let's return default of T. And that's just the easy way, depending on the type that the calling method is expecting, we can just return back a null in that default type. So that's easy enough. And if we did get back data, we want to deserialize it into the type that the calling method is expecting and pass in our JSON data. And that's it. Now we've got a general extension method or methods that we can use to set our cache and retrieve values from our cache. So let's move on to updating the actual page component to let us use it. So let's close that out because we're done with that for now. Now, the way I'm about to show this is not the way that I'd recommend implementing it in a production environment. I'm just doing this as an easy way to show how you can do this and then how where the data is coming from. So obviously, if you were doing this in production, you may want to take some extra time to break this down into multiple layers, or obviously organize your code in a different way. So let's go to this class here, so our code behind essentially for our page, and we need to add a few things. So the first thing we need to do is we need to inject this I distributed cache, because we got to be able to talk to our cache, and we'll name it cache. Let's do control period, get our using statement in there. Awesome. And the next thing we're going to want to do is we've already added in these variables, so we'll be able to dictate or specify and show when we're getting from our database and when we're getting from our cache. So let's do a couple of things here to our actual load method. The first thing we need to do is we need to add a record key because we're going to be writing to our cache. So let's just set a record key here. String record key equal to, and we'll just call it slow data. And actually, let's put that in our method. We don't need that to be out in the class at that level. We've already set our slow data to null, but we also want to set our load location now to null because we want to be able to put up a message to show us when we're getting from the database and when we're getting from the cache. And so the first thing we want to do is we want to try to get from the cache, right? We don't want to automatically go to the database every time. So let's say slow datum equal to await cache dot. And here's where we can use our extension methods. So get record async. Let's add our using statement so we can actually access that. And we're going to want a list of type slow data. And we're going to pass in our record key. So that's going to give a call out to our cache and return some type of response. So now we want to go and see if we got anything. So let's say slow datum is null. So if we didn't get anything, the next thing we want to do is go get the data from our database, right? So we've already got that here. And so we can actually take all this here. And we can actually get rid of this because we've got other await statements within our method now, so we can easily see when this thing is loading. All right, so if we have to go to our database, we're going to go do that using our data service. We're going to set a message saying that we're loading from our database. Now, the next thing we want to add to this part of the statement, though, is we want to go ahead and write this to our cache, write our results to our cache. So set record async. Again, passing in our record key. Pass in our data. And I'm going to go ahead and populate the expiration. So I'm going to say 10 seconds. So once this thing hits 10 seconds, expire it. That just speeds up our demo here. So else, so if we did get data back, let's set our load location, loaded from cache at, and let's just copy this up here. Okay. And in this situation, we'll just say is equal to, and this is just styling our message. So this will turn our text red because I'm using the Bootstrap library. All right. So that's got all that. I don't think there's any changes we need to make to the page because it's already checking everything and loading. I think we're ready to run this. Slow data, clicking the button to load. Obviously this first time it's loading, it's got to go to the database. And there it's loaded from the cache. You can see the difference in speed. It's almost immediate. And after 10 seconds, this should expire. And here we are again getting from the database. And that is about as fast as I can click. And that's it. That's how you load from the cache and integrate that with loading from the database. And that way, if you do have items that can be cached for a period of time, you can cache those items. You can set their expirations and then load them from the cache when they're available. And if they're not, you can go back to your data store and get them. Thanks for watching.